The twin sons of Draco Prime painted the sky in shades of orange and gold as the colony settlement buzzed with its usual morning activity. In the Draken district, where the proud dragon-like aliens built their homes into the cliffsides, something remarkable was happening. A clutch of eggs was hatching, and dozens of Draken families gathered to witness the birth of their newest generation. Skyfire watched anxiously as her eggs cracked open one by one. The first hatchling emerged strong and healthy, his wings already showing the telltale span that promised greatness. The second followed, equally impressive. But when the third egg finally broke apart, Skyfire's heart sank. The little one who would come to be called Ember struggled out, smaller than his siblings, with wings that looked twisted and wrong. The attending elders whispered among themselves. In Draken society, flight was everything. It determined your job, your status, your worth as a person. Those who soared highest led their people. Those who flew fastest became warriors and scouts. Even the merchants and craftsmen needed flight to reach the sky markets where business was conducted among the clouds. A Draken who couldn't fly was nothing. Less than nothing. As weeks passed, the truth became undeniable. While his siblings took their first wobbly flights, tumbling through the air with increasing confidence, Ember could barely glide. His wings wouldn't catch the air properly. When he tried to flap them, the motion was all wrong, creating drag instead of lift. Other young Drakens began to avoid him during play. Their parents pulled them away with pitying looks that cut deeper than any insult. Skyfire refused to give up on her son. She consulted Draken healers, but they offered no hope. She prayed at the Temple of Winds, but the priest told her this was simply nature's way. Some hatchlings weren't meant to fly. Perhaps Ember could serve in the ground crew, they suggested, maintaining the landing platforms or cleaning the lower market stalls. Jobs for those who couldn't reach the sky. Late one night, desperate and exhausted, Skyfire made a decision that could cost her everything. She wrapped Ember in cloth to hide his wings and carried him through the dark streets to the human quarter. The Drakens barely tolerated humans on their world. Humans couldn't fly, after all, which made them inferior in Draken eyes. They were useful for running ground-level businesses and doing work the Drakens considered beneath them, but they certainly weren't equals. The human quarter was a cramped collection of prefab buildings and converted warehouses clustered at the base of the cliffs. Skyfire had never been here before. She moved from door to door, asking quietly if anyone could help. Most humans shook their heads and closed their doors quickly. They knew better than to interfere with Draken family matters. Getting involved could mean losing their business permits or worse, being expelled from the colony entirely. She was about to give up when she found a small repair shop still lit despite the late hour. The sign read Morrison's Mechanics in both human and Draken script. Through the window, she could see a man working on what looked like a shuttle engine, his hands covered in grease, his face focused on the intricate machinery. Skyfire pushed the door open. The human looked up, surprised to see a Draken in his shop, especially at this hour. He was maybe 30 years old, with short brown hair and tired eyes that suggested too many late nights. "We're actually closed, but if it's an emergency repair, I can probably help," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's not a ship," Skyfire said quietly, her voice breaking. She unwrapped Ember, revealing the small hatchling with his malformed wings. "It's my son." The human, whose name was Jake Morrison, stared for a long moment. Then he gestured to a workbench. "Put him here. Let me see." As Jake examined Ember's wings, asking questions about Draken physiology and flight mechanics, Skyfire felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. This human wasn't looking at her son with pity. He was looking at him like a problem to be solved. "I won't lie to you," Jake finally said. "This is complicated. I'm not a doctor, I'm a mechanic. But I know about flight dynamics, about how things move through air. Maybe there's something I can do." "I can pay," Skyfire said quickly, pulling out a small pouch of thermal crystals, valuable gems the Drakens mined from deep volcanic chambers. Jake waved it away. "Let's see if I can actually help first. But you need to understand something. If other Drakens find out you brought your son to a human for help, there could be consequences." "I know," Skyfire said. "But he's my son. I'll do anything." Jake looked at the small hatchling on his workbench, at those eyes that glowed like tiny embers in the dim light. The kid was scared but trying to be brave. Jake had always been a sucker for lost causes. "All right then," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's teach a dragon how to fly." Jake Morrison had fixed a lot of things in his life. Broken engines, damaged hull plating, faulty navigation systems. But fixing a living creature's ability to fly? That was new territory, even for him. He spent the first week just observing, watching Ember try and fail to use his wings properly. Every attempt ended the same way, with the little Draken tumbling to the ground, frustration burning in his glowing eyes. The thing was, Jake didn't actually know much about Draken biology. Sure, he'd been on Draco Prime for 3 years, but the Drakens kept to themselves. They didn't exactly invite humans to study their anatomy or share their medical texts. So Jake did what any good mechanic would do. He started from scratch, treating the problem like any other engineering challenge. He began spending his mornings in the colony's central plaza, coffee in hand, watching young Drakens practice their flight. He brought a small notebook and sketched constantly. Wing angles during takeoff. The way their tails shifted for balance. How they beat their wings during climbs versus glides. The other humans thought he'd lost his mind, sitting there for hours just staring at the sky. The Drakens who noticed him looked annoyed, like he was some creepy stalker watching their kids. But Jake was seeing things. Things that surprised him. The young Drakens flew through sheer power, beating their massive wings hard and fast, muscling their way through the air. It worked because they were strong and their wings were huge. But it wasn't elegant. It wasn't efficient. They burned energy like crazy, which is why even the young ones had to eat constantly and rest between flights. Back in his workshop, Jake pulled up everything he could find in the colony's database about flight mechanics. He studied birds from Earth, insects, even ancient aircraft designs. He ran simulations on his computer, inputting what he'd learned about Draken physiology. And slowly, a picture emerged that nobody had seen before. Draken flight was wasteful. They'd never needed to optimize it because their bodies were built like tanks. Big muscles, huge wings, incredible stamina. They could afford to be inefficient. But Ember couldn't. His smaller frame and malformed wings meant he needed to be smart, not strong. One evening, Jake spread out his notes and sketches on the workbench. Ember sat nearby, watching with curious eyes. The hatchling had been coming to the workshop every day after Sci-Fi finished her work in the sky markets. At first, he'd been terrified of Jake, this strange wingless creature with soft skin. But curiosity had won out over fear. "Come here, buddy. Let me show you something," Jake said, pulling up a video on his tablet. It showed a hawk from Earth, soaring in lazy circles without flapping its wings once. "See that? That bird is barely moving, but it's climbing higher and higher. Know why?" Ember tilted his head, the universal gesture of confusion that apparently worked across species. "Thermals. Hot air rising. The bird positions its wings just right and lets the air do the work." Jake sketched quickly, showing how air currents worked, how angle of attack mattered more than raw power. "Your people fly like they're always in a fight. All muscle, no finesse. But you can't do that. You need to be like this hawk. You need to work smarter." Over the next few weeks, Jake became obsessed with the project. He measured everything about Ember. Wing surface area, bone structure, muscle attachment points. He had Ember perform simple movements while cameras recorded from multiple angles. The little Draken was patient, even when the tests got boring or frustrating. The data painted a clear picture. Ember's wings weren't just small. They were built wrong. The membrane was too thick, creating excess drag. The muscles attached at angles that made proper wing articulation nearly impossible. In Draken terms, he was defective. But Jake saw potential. If Ember couldn't change his biology, they'd change his technique. Jake started sketching designs for training wings. Not replacements, but supplements. Something that would attach to Ember's natural wings and compensate for their weaknesses while teaching his body the right movements. It was like training wheels on a bicycle, but infinitely more complex. He raided his scrap pile, pulling apart old drones and shuttles for materials. Carbon fiber struts that were strong but weighed almost nothing. Synthetic membrane material used in emergency shelter tents. Micro-servos salvaged from robotic arms. He worked late into the nights, fueled by coffee and stubbornness, while Ember dozed in a corner of the workshop. The hardest part was figuring out the control system. The wings needed to respond to Ember's muscle movements, amplifying them and correcting for his structural problems. Too much assistance and Ember would never learn proper technique. Too little and the wings would be useless. Jake went through 7 prototypes, each one ending up in the scrap pile. On the 8th attempt, something clicked. Jake had created a system that read the electrical signals from Ember's wing muscles and translated them into servo movements. When Ember tried to flap, the training wings would extend and angle properly, showing his body what the movement should feel like. Over time, muscle memory would take over. Jake held up the finished prototype. It looked strange, this framework of struts and membrane that would wrap around Ember's natural wings. Delicate but strong. What do you think, kid? Ember approached cautiously, sniffing at the device. Then his eyes brightened, glowing more intensely. He understood, in that moment, what Jake was offering. Not a permanent crutch, but a teacher. A way to learn what his body couldn't figure out on its own. When Skyfire arrived that evening to collect her son, Jake showed her the training wings. She was quiet for a long time, running her claws gently over the framework. No Draken has ever needed such things, she said softly. Maybe that's the problem, Jake replied. Sometimes tradition blinds us to better solutions. Your people fly through power. Ember's going to fly through skill. Skyfire looked at her son, at the hope burning in his eyes. She'd come to this human's workshop expecting nothing, maybe a kind word and a quick dismissal. Instead, she'd found someone who looked at her son and saw possibility instead of limitations. When do we start? She asked. Jake grinned. How about tomorrow morning? The first time Jake strapped the training wings onto Ember, the little Draken looked terrified. The framework felt foreign against his natural wings, the struts pressing gently against muscle and bone. Ember's instinct was to shake them off, to reject this strange human contraption. But Jake's calm voice talked him through it, adjusting straps and checking connections until everything sat just right. We're not flying today, Jake said firmly. Not tomorrow either. First, we build strength. That disappointed Ember, who'd imagined soaring through the sky the moment the wings were attached. But Jake knew better. You couldn't just strap on equipment and expect miracles. The body needed to learn, muscles needed to develop, and technique had to become second nature. They started with exercises that looked ridiculous. Jake had Ember stand on his workshop floor, extending his wings slowly, holding positions that made the muscles burn. The training wings provided resistance, forcing Ember to work harder than normal. 10 seconds of holding. Then 20. Then 30. Ember's wings trembled with effort, but Jake wouldn't let him quit. Pain means progress, Jake said, though he kept the session short enough that Ember wouldn't injure himself. Your siblings got strong by flying constantly. You're getting strong by training smart. Between exercises, Jake taught theory. He showed Ember videos of Earth birds, explaining how they used air currents and wing positioning. He demonstrated with paper airplanes how tiny adjustments in angle could mean the difference between soaring and crashing. At first, Ember didn't understand why any of this mattered. But slowly, concepts started clicking into place. Flight wasn't just about flapping hard. It was about understanding the invisible ocean of air all around them. After 2 weeks of ground training, Jake introduced movement exercises. Ember would run through the workshop, wings extended, learning how air resistance felt at different speeds. The training wing servos activated during these runs, showing Ember's muscles the proper motion patterns. It felt strange, having machinery guide his wings through movements they'd never made naturally. But gradually, it started feeling less foreign and more right. The other humans in the quarter had noticed Jake's project by now. Some stopped by to watch, offering encouragement or asking questions. A woman named Betty who ran the coffee shop next door started bringing Ember special treats, little pastries she'd learned the Drakens liked. An older mechanic named Frank offered Jake some lightweight alloy he'd been hoarding, perfect for reinforcing the wing struts. But not everyone approved. A few humans thought Jake was wasting his time on a species that treated them as inferior. Why help them when they looked down on us? One man argued. Jake's response was simple. Because that kid deserves a chance, regardless of what his people think of mine. By the 4th week, Ember could run through the workshop with his wings creating actual lift. His feet would leave the ground for a fraction of a second, just the tiniest hop. But it was progress. Real, measurable progress. Ember's confidence grew with each session. The despair that had clouded his eyes when Jake first met him was gone, replaced by determination. Jake decided it was time for the real test. He loaded Ember and the training wings into his beat-up transport truck and drove out into the wilderness beyond the colony. Skyfire followed in her own vehicle, having taken a rare day off from work. They traveled for an hour, leaving behind the settlements and sky platforms, until they reached a secluded canyon with high walls and soft sand at the bottom. This is it, Jake announced, climbing out of the truck. Today, you fly. Ember's excitement was immediately tempered by fear. The canyon suddenly looked enormous. The sky seemed impossibly high. What if he failed? What if the training wings didn't work? What if he tumbled to the ground like always, except this time in front of his mother and the human who'd worked so hard to help him? Jake knelt down, putting himself at Ember's eye level. Listen to me. You've done everything right. Your muscles are stronger. You know the techniques. The wings will help, but you're the one doing the flying. Trust yourself. He activated the training wings full assist mode. The servos hummed softly, ready to amplify and correct Ember's movements. Jake pointed to a gentle slope leading up the canyon wall. Start there. Run down, build speed, and when you feel ready, jump. Ember climbed the slope on shaky legs. From up there, the canyon floor looked even farther away. His mother called encouragement in the Draken language, her voice echoing off the stone walls. Jake gave him a thumbs up. That strange human gesture Ember had learned meant good luck. Taking a deep breath, Ember started running. His feet pounded against the rocky ground, building speed. The wind rushed past his face. The training wings extended, catching the air. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to stay safely on the ground. But he'd come too far to quit now. He jumped. For a terrifying second, gravity pulled him down. But then the training wings bit into the air, the servos activated, and suddenly he was rising. Actually rising. His natural wings flapped in coordination with the training supports, the movements feeling both foreign and perfectly right. The ground fell away beneath him. He was flying. It lasted maybe 30 seconds before Ember's inexperience caught up with him. He overcorrected on a turn, the wings twisted wrong, and he tumbled sideways through the air. The soft sand rushed up to meet him. He hit hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs, rolling through the dune in a cloud of dust. Jake ran over, worried Ember might be hurt. But the little Draken was laughing. Not a quiet chuckle, but a full-throated, joyous laugh that echoed through the canyon. Sand covered his scales, one of the training wing struts had bent slightly, but none of that mattered. Skyfire landed beside them, tears streaming down her scaled face. She'd never cried from happiness before, but she couldn't stop. Her son had flown. Badly, briefly, but he'd flown. Again, Ember demanded, scrambling to his feet. I want to go again. Jake checked the training wings, straightened the bent strut, and nodded. Again. But this time, remember what I said about the turning angle. They spent the entire day in that canyon. Ember flew again and again, each attempt lasting a bit longer, getting a bit smoother. He crashed more times than Jake could count, but the sand was forgiving and Ember's determination was limitless. By sunset, he managed a full minute of sustained flight, circling the canyon twice before landing with only a slight stumble. On the drive back to the colony, Ember fell asleep in the back of the truck, exhausted but content. Jake glanced at Skyfire in the passenger seat. He's going to make it, Jake said quietly. Skyfire nodded, but worry crossed her face. Others will find out soon. This cannot stay secret forever. Jake knew she was right. Word was already spreading through the human quarter. And in a colony this size, secrets never lasted long. The Drakens would discover what they'd done. The only question was when, and what would happen then. 3 months had passed since that first flight in the canyon. Ember had progressed beyond Jake's wildest expectations. The training wings had done their job, teaching his muscles the proper movements, building strength in all the right places. Now Ember could fly short distances without any assistance at all, using only his natural wings and the techniques Jake had taught him. They weren't pretty flights, nothing like the powerful soaring of other young Drakens, but they were real. Jake had started reducing the training wings' assistance gradually, letting Ember's own body do more of the work. The kid was learning to read air currents, to position his wings for maximum efficiency, to conserve energy instead of burning through it. Everything the natural-born flyers did through instinct and raw power, Ember was learning to do through skill and understanding. But success had made them careless. Ember had grown confident, sometimes practicing near the colony instead of making the long trip to their secret canyon. He'd fly in the early mornings, thinking nobody would notice. And for a while, nobody did. The Drakens were late risers, preferring to fly during the warmest parts of the day when thermals were strongest. Then came the morning that changed everything. Ember was practicing near the eastern cliffs, working on sustained gliding. He'd been in the air for nearly 3 minutes, a personal record, when a Draken noble named Stormclaw happened to fly past on his way to the morning council session. What Stormclaw saw made him stop mid-flight, hovering in disbelief. There was Skyfire's defective hatchling, the one everyone pitied, actually flying. But he was wearing some kind of mechanical contraption on his wings. Human technology. The abomination was using human devices to mock the sacred act of flight. Stormclaw didn't confront them directly. Instead, he flew straight to the conclave chambers and demanded an emergency session. By midday, official summons had been delivered to Skyfire's home, to Jake's workshop. They were to appear before the conclave immediately to answer for their crimes against nature and Draken tradition. Jake had known this day would come eventually, but he'd hoped for more time. He'd hoped Ember would be flying completely unassisted by then, making the training wings irrelevant. But life rarely gave you the timing you wanted. He closed his workshop, put on his cleanest shirt, and met Skyfire and Ember at the base of the council mountain. The walk up to the conclave chambers was long and deliberately exhausting. Drakens could fly up in seconds, but groundbound visitors had to climb the winding stairs carved into the mountain face. It was a reminder of their inferior status. By the time Jake reached the top, his legs burned and sweat soaked through his shirt. Beside him, Skyfire looked terrified, while Ember tried to appear brave. The conclave chamber was massive, a natural cave expanded and shaped over generations. Stone pillars rose hundreds of feet to the ceiling, and perched on these pillars were the eldest Drakens of the colony. 15 ancient beings, their scales dulled by age but their eyes sharp with intelligence and judgment. At the center, on the highest pillar, sat High Sky Lord Thunderwing, the oldest Draken on the planet. Jake, Skyfire, and Ember stood in a pit at the chamber's center, literally being looked down upon by their judges. Dozens of other Drakens filled the viewing galleries, word of the trial having spread quickly. Jake recognized some of the faces from the plaza where he'd spent those early mornings studying flight patterns. None of them looked friendly. Stormclaw presented his accusation with dramatic flair. He described the abomination he'd witnessed, a defective hatchling corrupted by human technology, mocking the natural order. He spoke of tradition violated, of the sacred gift of flight being perverted by machines. Other Drakens in the galleries murmured agreement. When Stormclaw finished, High Sky Lord Thunderwing turned his ancient gaze to Skyfire. "You sought help from humans? For your hatchling's condition?" Skyfire's voice shook but remained steady. "I sought help anywhere I could find it. He is my son." "And you," Thunderwing addressed Jake, "you presume to teach Drakens about flight? You, who have no wings, who cannot know the sky." This was the moment Jake had been preparing for. He'd rehearsed different approaches, different arguments. Humble apology? Defiant challenge? In the end, he chose honesty. "I don't presume anything," Jake said clearly, his voice carrying through the chamber. "I'm a mechanic. I understand how things move through air." When Skyfire asked for help, I applied that understanding to her son's problem. And it worked. "It is unnatural," Stormclaw hissed. "Flight is a gift, not a skill to be learned through machinery." "Is it?" Jake looked up at the assembled Drakens. "I've spent months studying your flight. You're incredible, powerful, but you're also inefficient. You burn 3 times the energy you need to because you rely on strength instead of technique. Ember's condition forced us to find a better way." The chamber erupted in angry shouts. How dare this human criticize Draken flight? The noise was deafening until Thunderwing raised one wing for silence. "You claim our flight is flawed." The ancient Draken's voice was dangerous. Jake's heart pounded, but he pushed forward. "I'm saying there's room for improvement. The training wings taught Ember techniques that any Draken could use. He flies farther on less energy. He can read air currents you ignore. He's smaller and weaker than others his age, but he can already outglide most of them." "Lies," Stormclaw spat. "Then test him," Jake said. "The Youth Ascension race is in 1 month. Let Ember compete. If he fails, if he places in the bottom half, then you can exile all 3 of us. But if he succeeds, if he proves that these methods work, then you have to acknowledge that maybe humans have something valuable to offer." The conclave members conferred among themselves, their voices too low for Jake to hear. Finally, Thunderwing spoke. "Very well. We accept this challenge. But understand the terms clearly. If the hatchling fails, if he places below the middle ranking, then he and his mother will be exiled from Draca Prime. And you, human, will be expelled from this world forever. All 3 of you will lose everything." Jake looked at Skyfire, who nodded despite her fear. Then at Ember, whose eyes burned bright with determination. "We accept," Jake said. As they left the chamber, Jake's mind was already racing. 1 month to prepare Ember for the most important race of his life. 1 month to prove that innovation could triumph over tradition. The stakes couldn't be higher, but backing down had never been an option. That night, back in his workshop, Jake pulled out his notebooks and started planning. They'd need new training routines, refined techniques, every advantage he could give Ember. The kid had come so far already. Now they just needed to go a little farther. Outside, the twin suns set over Draca Prime, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Somewhere in that sky, young Drakons were practicing for the race, unaware that everything was about to change. Jake watched them through his window, studying their movements, looking for weaknesses to exploit. 1 month, he muttered to himself. We can do this in 1 month. He had to believe that. Because the alternative was losing everything they'd worked for, and watching a kid who deserved to fly get cast out of the only home he'd ever known. The month before the Youth Ascension race became the most intense period of Jake's life. He barely slept, spending every spare moment refining Ember's training regimen. They practiced at dawn before the other Drakons were awake, worked on technique in Jake's workshop during midday, and studied flight theory late into the evening. Ember's determination never wavered, even when his muscles ached and exhaustion made his wings tremble. But something unexpected happened during those weeks. Other young Drakons started watching their practice sessions. At first, they came to mock Ember, calling him the human's pet and making jokes about his mechanical wings. But a few of the curious ones stayed longer, asking questions about what Jake was teaching. One young Drakon named Hatchling approached Jake nervously after a practice session. That thing you showed Ember, about riding the thermal currents without flapping. Could that really work for anyone? Jake looked at the youngster, then at his mother hovering protectively nearby. Sure could. Want me to show you? Word got back to Hatchling's parents, and Jake expected anger. Instead, the father showed up at his workshop 2 days later. My son says you taught him something in 10 minutes that improved his endurance. I don't understand how a human could know these things, but if it helps him in the race, I want you to teach him more. Jake helped where he could, though he kept his focus on Ember. 2 other families quietly sought his advice as well. Most Drakons still viewed the whole situation with disgust, but a few pragmatic parents recognized results when they saw them. Their children needed every advantage in the race, and pride was less important than success. The public practice sessions became uncomfortable for Ember. Older Drakons would hover nearby, making loud comments about abominations and corrupted traditions. Some young races deliberately flew close to Ember during practice, trying to intimidate him or throw off his concentration. Stormclaw himself showed up once, watching with cold eyes before flying away without a word. Jake worried about the psychological pressure, but Ember handled it better than expected. Let them talk, the young Drakon said one evening. I'll answer them with my flight. As race day approached, Jake made a critical decision. The rules allowed Ember to use the training wings for the first half of the race, but Jake knew that wouldn't be enough. The second half, flown without assistance, would be the real test. So they spent the final week practicing the transition, having Ember detach the wings mid-flight and continue on his own. It was risky and difficult, but Ember mastered it. The night before the race, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat in his workshop, double-checking the training wings for the 100th time. Every connection, every servo, every strap. There could be no equipment failures tomorrow. Too much was riding on this. Skyfire stopped by around midnight, unable to sleep either. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said quietly, thank you. You gave my son something I couldn't. You gave him hope. Jake nodded, emotion tightening his throat. He's a good kid. He deserves this chance. Race day dawned clear and bright, perfect flying weather. The course had been used for generations, a brutal circuit through the jagged peaks surrounding the colony. It tested speed, precision, and endurance over 10 miles of challenging terrain. 60 young Drakons had entered, the largest class in years. Everyone wanted to witness the spectacle of the defective hatchling's inevitable failure. Hundreds of adult Drakons filled the sky around the starting platform, perched on cliff faces and hovering in viewing positions. The human quarter had turned out in force too, clustered on the ground-level viewing areas. Betty from the coffee shop had made a banner that read Go Ember. Several other humans held signs supporting their unexpected representative. Jake stood with Ember at the starting line, making final adjustments to the training wings. The other young races gave them a wide berth, some looking disgusted, others curious. Ashwing and the 2 others Jake had helped gave Ember subtle nods of encouragement. Remember the plan, Jake said, keeping his voice calm despite his racing heart. Use the training wings to conserve energy in the first half. Don't try to keep up with the power flyers at the start. Let them burn themselves out. When you reach Needle Peak at the halfway point, detach the wings and fly your own race. Ember's eyes glowed bright. I'm ready. The High Sky Lord Thunderwing himself presided over the start. At his signal, 60 young Drakons launched into the sky in an explosion of wings and color. The powerful ones shot forward immediately, racing toward the first checkpoint with raw speed. Ember started slower, using the training wings to gain altitude efficiently while others exhausted themselves with aggressive climbing. Jake couldn't follow the race directly, but large viewing screens had been set up showing footage from camera drones. He watched Ember's position, his heart in his throat. The kid was in the bottom third initially, but holding steady while others began to falter. The course was brutal. Tight turns through narrow canyons where one mistake meant crashing into stone walls. Long stretches where competitors had to maintain speed against headwinds. Vertical climbs that tested strength and stamina. Several young dragons dropped out in the first 20 minutes, exhausted or injured from crashes. Ember reached the halfway point in 38th place out of the remaining 52 racers. Not great, but not eliminated either. Jake watched the screen as Ember circled Needle Peak, then executed the maneuver they'd practiced 100 times. The training wings detached cleanly, falling away toward the recovery nets below. Now came the real test. Ember flying on his own, with everything Jake had taught him but none of the mechanical assistance. For a heart-stopping moment, Ember wobbled, adjusting to the sudden change. Then his wings found their rhythm, moving with the efficiency Jake had drilled into him. What happened next shocked everyone watching. Ember spotted a thermal updraft that the other racers had missed, spiraling upward with minimal effort. While competitors around him flapped frantically to maintain altitude, Ember rode the rising air, gaining height and speed while conserving energy. Jake recognized the technique, something they'd studied from Earth's soaring birds. Ember started passing exhausted racers. 35th place. Then 30th. The dragons in the viewing areas murmured in confusion. How was the defective hatchling moving up through the rankings? The final stretch was a straight sprint back to the colony, 5 miles of open air where power and speed mattered most. This should have been where Ember fell behind. But something remarkable happened. While other young dragons flew in straight lines, fighting air resistance with brute force, Ember adjusted his body position constantly. Reducing drag, catching favorable air currents, using techniques none of the others knew existed. Jake watched the screen, barely breathing. Ember passed another racer. Then another. The humans in the viewing area started cheering. Even some dragons seemed impressed, though they tried to hide it. With a mile to go, Ember was in 20th place. Then 18th. A powerful racer named Cinderfang pulled alongside, trying to intimidate Ember with aggressive wing beats. But Ember stayed focused, using Cinderfang's turbulence to gain a tiny speed advantage. The finish line appeared ahead. Ember was in 16th place now, wings burning with effort but still maintaining form. He crossed the line in 14th place out of 60 starters, with only 48 finishes total. The crowd fell silent. He'd done it. More than done it. He'd placed well above the middle requirement. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. They'd won. Ember had proven himself. As the exhausted young dragons landed at the finish platform, Jake pushed through the crowd to reach his student. Ember collapsed onto the platform, wings trembling with exhaustion. But his eyes blazed with triumph. Skyfire landed beside him seconds later, wrapping her wings around her son while tears streamed down her face. The High Sky Lord Thunderwing descended to the platform, his ancient face unreadable. The crowd hushed, waiting for judgment. The hatchling has met the challenge terms, he announced. The exile order is void. But then Thunderwing did something unexpected. He looked at the results board, where Ashwing and the other young dragons Jake had helped were also listed in the top 20. It appears, the ancient dragon said slowly, that these new techniques have merit. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it wasn't condemnation either. The conclave couldn't ignore results this clear. In the days that followed, everything changed. More families approached Jake asking about his methods. The conclave didn't officially approve, but they didn't forbid it either. Young dragons started showing up at Jake's workshop, curious about the human who'd taught their peer to fly. Ember would always be smaller than other dragons, always different. But he flew now on his own wings, using skill where others used strength. And in Jake's workshop, a waiting list grew longer each day. Sometimes you don't change a culture by fighting it directly. Sometimes you change it by teaching one kid to fly, and letting others see what becomes possible when you challenge old assumptions. Jake had come to Draco Prime as just another human mechanic, tolerated but dismissed. Now he was the guy who taught a dragon to soar.